This is the Amidon Planet Podcast, episode 75. I'm your host, Joel Amidon. Thank you for joining me on this never-ending quest to figure out how to teach better. Today on the podcast, we are talking about summer reading. This is the summer reading edition of the Amidon Planet Podcast, and I get to talk about it with the biggest advocate I know of reading, and that's Dr. Rosemary Oliphant-Ingham. She's a professor of teacher education here at the University of Mississippi, and we both have a shared love of these, what we're going to call Western novels. So your Longmire, that was a TV show on Netflix, but before it was a TV show, it was a set of books by Craig Johnson, and we had those books, we would pass them back and forth, and then she came up with another series to then look at, and that happens to be C.J. Box, whose character Joe Pickett is actually featured now on a series on Paramount Plus, which is cool. Anyway, these sorts of Western sort of characters, you know, kind of cowboyish sort of things. But anyway, we have this love of these sorts of books, and they're the common, like, you know, Jack Reacher or, Jack Ryan, any Jack. Anyway, these sorts of, character-driven novels that are kind of formulaic. It reminded me back of the Hardy Boys when I was a kid, that I love reading those as well. And I thought, you know what? There is something to be learned from these books about teaching. You know, why do we love them? I mean, if we love them, there's something to be learned about teaching or learning or whatever. And so I wanted to talk about them with my friend Rosemary Oliphant-Ingham, who is an expert on reading, and she was game. She was game to have some discussions. So you're going to learn a little bit in this conversation about reading, about maybe even things to promote within reading. So even to think about, so much stress gets put on like what people are reading and how they should read it, versus she's like, just read. And it's kind of refreshing sort of thing. So maybe you're heading to the beach. Maybe this is something to listen to on your way there. Maybe you're, we've had a rough year, rough set of years, rough semester. If you're a teacher and thinking about, just want to decompress a little bit, and maybe you're one of these sorts of books, these like, those paperback books that you can get at your independent bookstores, like Square Books here in Oxford, Mississippi. Those little paperbacks that fit nice into your bag. Maybe you're looking for one. And so this is maybe reassuring that, hey, one, great, go read it and take that time for yourself to just enjoy a good story. Some of those, with those characters that you know and love. Or maybe you're picking up a new book with some new characters, and maybe we mentioned something here that you want to pick up. Anyway, and just saying also too that there's something to be learned here as well. Not that we want you to relax and maybe just put everything to the side for a second, but there is still something to be learned from these books. And so this was a great conversation with my friend, Rosemary Oliphant-Ingham. So without further delay, here it is. Rosemary Oliphant-Ingham, thank you for joining me on the Amidon Planet Podcast. How are you?
I am fine. How are you?
Oh, this is a good day. This is a good day. I can't believe we got a chance to do some talk about summer reads. We're going to be talking about some summer reads here on the Amidon Planet Podcast. And what would you describe as a summer read? Well, first of all, I think you're the biggest reader or the greatest reader I've ever heard. Because that's your main. Your main way of gaining information is reading. Would you say that?
Yes, it is my job as a literature professor. That's my job. So, the old adage, find something to do that you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And so when I'm reading, I just tell people to leave me alone. I'm working.
There you go.
So I love to read. And because I love to read, you are the reason that I'm reading or have read the books that we're talking about today. I'm sure you remember, 6, 7, 8 years ago, you introduced me to Craig Johnson.
That's right. Craig Johnson.
And I got hooked on, I'm going to call them the Western novels.
Western novels.
So I appreciate you getting me hooked on that. And from that, I've gone to, not sure if you gave me C.J. Box or somebody else gave me that. And then also William, oh my gosh, his name just left me, William Kent Kruger.
Yeah, that's the new one.
That's, he's not that new, but I've just discovered him, and I don't think you've discovered him yet.
New to us.
Yes.
New to us. So, yeah, and so for those that don't know, Craig Johnson is the author of Longmire. And so this is where this goes back to. So Katie's grandmother who has passed away, but she wanted to buy everyone in the family a book. So we went to Walmart to get books or buy her the place that she lived. And so it was like summertime, and she's like wants to get everybody a book. And I saw that there was something, the first is, I think, Craig Johnson's first book about Walt Longmire was The Cold Dish. And I saw that in Walmart, and it was like, now a Netflix show. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of they thought it was good enough to make it into a show. So I'm like, I'll get this, a little cheap paperback book. And it was $8.99. And like, here, Grandma, this is the book that I want. And just loved it. And then knew, you loved books. And if you go into Rosemary's office, you see that there is just books everywhere. And what fraction of the books that you own would be in your office? What do you think?
Oh, not even probably 10, 15%.
Oh, yeah. And they're all over. And so I'm like, hey, yes. Rosemary, try this out. And here we go. And now it's been back and forth for many years of trading these Western novels. Like Walt Longmire, for those that don't know, is a sheriff of Absaroka County in Wyoming, I believe.
No idea.
Yeah. With all these details. But I thought, hey, I've enjoyed these novels so much. And then, I go on these runs, Rosemary, where all of a sudden like things come to me and I want to talk about them. And I thought, you know what? There's something about these novels, these types of novels, these kind of maybe even like formulaic sort of mystery novels, but they're not really formulaic, but they're kind of a little bit mystery novels where I wanted to talk about them, and like that there's actually something that can be learned about them from teaching, that we can learn something about them to help us with our teaching. And you thought, I don't know what you think about it, but I want to at least throw some of these ideas at you. And so here we are. We're here.
Oh, I definitely agree. Any piece of literature you read, I don't care what it is, any piece of literature, you can learn something. And that's what we're in the business of, is teaching people to learn.
Yeah.
And as a literature person, I want to find books that will interest my clientele. And everybody's not going to buy into Wuthering Heights. Okay. Everybody's not going to buy into Silas Marner. But everybody you've seen My Door. It's a James Patterson quote that says, I'm paraphrasing very badly, there's not a kid who doesn't like to read. There are only kids who haven't been given the right books.
Right.
And so as a reader, you and I both know, because we both read everything, not just the Western novels.
Right. Yeah.
That we have wealth of knowledge that when somebody talks about reading, we can say, have you tried? And we're helping people create readers. So in the area of education, we are helping people become readers by knowing books, a variety of genres that might interest our students.
Yeah. And that's right. I love, we live in a town that's got the greatest independent bookstore in the country.
Probably. Yeah.
Yeah. Square Books. And then there's Square Books Junior, and there's Off Square Books. And so,
and now there's historical Square Books. Or
rare Square Books.
Rare Square. Right. Yeah. So 4 books.
And so like, I remember, my kids have always been good readers, and you've been a big supporter of that. And like, when they come to your office, like, hey, have you read this? Have you read this? And so, but going into Square Books Junior and basically and giving them some ideas for like, hey, here's what Jack, my son Jack, is into, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, like, here's 5 recommendations for books that we think Jack would really love. Or, Noah came in and he needed to find a book that was at a certain Lexile count, but was interested in some of the things that he was into, like kind of the fantasy sort of things. And they thought about it for a second. They're trying to find one that had, there's this one. It's a novel about the Napoleonic Wars, but with dragons. and he loved it. He loved it. He read it. It met his needs. And it's like having those sorts of, finding the things that interest you and being able to say that, there's a book out there for you.
And I'm going to jump in here, and you mentioned Lexile levels. And for me, that is a 4-letter word, because we don't need, no, that's fine. We don't need to be looking at the reading level of books as much as we need to be looking at the student's interest. You and I both know,
yeah,
and I know your boys are fantastic readers, and they have read things that are way above their ugly word, Lexile level,
right,
just because they were interested in it.
Absolutely.
And so we need to get away from this idea, oh, well, this is, like a third grade reading level. Is it the kid interested in it?
Right.
That's the main thing. So think interest level more than anything else.
Yeah, that big, there's because we both are professors in the School of Education. And so thinking about, there's some research from Constance Steinkuhlers, who does a lot of research on like video games and stuff, but also thinking about literacy. And she did some studies on advancing students in their abilities to read, and like was showing that just having that interest, and all of a sudden, like these kids were playing this video game, War of the Worlds, or World of Warcraft. That's it. Not War of the Worlds. That was a radio play. World of Warcraft, where they had to there's a big challenge. They had to defeat this dragon, which is all a bunch of them have to get together and defeat a dragon. It's really hard, but they found this reading and someone that had written about how to defeat the dragon. And it was, way beyond their quote unquote Lexile levels. I guess we are swearing on this podcast a little bit. But because they were interested, because they had this need, they were they just devoured that read, and they put it into play, and they defeated the dragon. And so they were able to overcome these things because of, again, what you said, interest is the biggest variable, and making sure how can we put things in front of folks that interest them. Right.
And I'm going to go back to a book, oh my gosh, 80s maybe, Daniel Fader's Hooked on Books. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Joel is much younger than I, and so he doesn't know this. Daniel Fader was a newspaper writer, but he very much wanted people to read. This is a story in his book, from Hooked on Books, that he wrote. So I'm giving him credit for this. He decided to give books to a juvenile establishment where kids that had been in trouble, give them books. And back then he gave paperbacks, because paperbacks were supposed to be a little bit racier than hardbacks and so on and so forth. And every kid got a book. They could read it. They could throw it away. They could sell it. They could swap it, whatever. But this one kid ended up with The Scarlet Letter. Even though it's a classic. And I guess he read the blurb on it. He read the book, and he came back to the person who had given him the book and looked at her and said, "This ain't about no whore." And so what had picked, he was a street kid, and he was from Chicago, Detroit, I'm not sure what town, but he was a street kid. And that's what someone had said to him, well, this is a book about. And he read the book because he thought it was going to be about that. And then he came back and said it wasn't. So not only did he read a book that was way above his probably Lexile level, it was a classic, and most kids don't want to read classics, but also he truly understood the book.
Yeah.
And I love that story from, again, Daniel Fader, Hooked on Books.
Yep. And think about this podcast, we can put links to books, and so if people are interested, or even just references to, so we can, so people can investigate further. So yeah, we can definitely mention that one. When I guess to the things that, I guess I was supported in my reading, and maybe we could talk about yours too, is my dad would always go to the library, and we would, the library was a constant place that we would go to, and going to the public library was a highlight to go get some more books. And it was there was power there, because I know not only just getting books. So I was a big Hardy Boys and fan of those books. And then when Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew would get together for some super caper, that was amazing. But then also too, there was there was books about free stuff you could get in the mail or something, and so to be able to send off it told you, if you send a letter to this address, NASA is going to send back pictures of the shuttle or something like that. There was some power with going to the library outside of just getting the books. But that was a pretty cool place, I know, for me as a kid.
Well, I have a very different story. I was a non-reader. And I realized that when I got to Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, and was doing my master's degree in reading. I was a product of the 40s, where the look-say method, sight word method, where you just memorized. I had no phonics growing up at all. And so when I started my master's degree at Ole Miss, I figured out what my problem was. I didn't know how to attack words. I didn't have word attack skills. I basically taught myself word attack skills. And the way I read now started in my mid-20s, and I haven't stopped.
Wow.
So I'm saying that for people out there who may have a young child, a teenager, or even a young adult who doesn't like to read, don't give up on them.
Right.
Find something that they're interested in. And I started my reading with, can't think of the names now, the Danielle Steele books of that era, only I wasn't reading Danielle Steele. I was reading Victoria Holt and I don't know, people like that. But the romance novels, very similar, and this is a segue, very similar to the books that we're supposed to be talking about today.
Yeah. There you go.
In that they had recurring characters. The themes, the plots were very similar because this is one thing you and I have talked about, is that these stories have kind of a flow of them. You kind of know what's coming next. There's always a man in power.
Right.
The sheriff, the C.J. Cox is a game warden. The William Kent Kruger books, he is a sheriff that had some issues and had to give up, and now he's a PI. But they are all kind of men with issues, or protagonists with issues.
Yeah.
But they overcome those issues, and most of the ones are the ones I'm remembering, and we've both read probably 50 of these by now.
Yeah.
They more or less fall into the mystery that happens.
Right.
They don't go out seeking it. It just kind of comes to them, especially with C.J. Box and Joe Pickett as a game warden. He's really not supposed to be working with murders and all of that stuff. So it just kind of comes to him. I love the books, number one, for the storylines. But number two, and I'm going a little bit off base, because I don't know very much of that part of the country.
Right.
Longmire is in Montana,
Wyoming, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Pickett is in Wyoming.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Montana, Wyoming. Yep. Good.
And Cork O'Connor, who is the William Kent Kruger person, is in Minnesota, but they also range from Minnesota to Wisconsin. I'll just tell you, they do talk about Wisconsin a little bit, but they also go to Michigan, and they talk about the Upper Peninsula.
Yep, the UP, yeah.
The UP. And I am a huge geography person. And I realize these men really have done their research. These writers really have done their research. So you're really learning about geography while you're reading these books. And it's more of osmosis than it is, I'm studying geography.
Right.
But I told you I finished the last C.J. Box book this week, and you'll get it the next time I'm in the office. And they're going from Wyoming to Denver, and from Denver up to Seattle. And they go from Denver to Salt Lake City. And I know that area, and I'm thinking, I think he kind of made a mistake there. So I went and dug my atlas out. And he didn't make a mistake. And so that really, for me, solidifies the idea that not only you're getting a good story, but you're also learning geography. You're learning about the weather, the climate of the area. Again, that's education for me.
Yeah. Well, and I introduced one to you about Peter Ash. That's the Nick Petrie has made these Peter Ash novels, and his is like a modern day. These are modern day story about a veteran suffering from PTSD who has to sleep outside. If he goes inside, he has this white static that builds up, and so you're learning a little bit about, so not only geographic research, but even like this author is doing research on like, what are veterans suffering from? Like, what are some things that, obviously there's some fantastical parts of the book, but still thinking about like, what are some things that might have to deal with, and like some of the, things that they're leaning on from their training that helps them to get by with some things. And so like those, and also too, the Peter Ash novel was written by a guy from Wisconsin. So the first one was in Milwaukee. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like driving through Milwaukee when you're talking about this car chase that's happening. Like, I know exactly where they're at. And so,
and that goes back to my point about geography.
Yeah.
They've done their research. They know what they're doing. Well, William Kent Kruger and C.J. Box both do a lot with Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that. But I'm learning a lot about the indigenous people, Native Americans, First Nations that I did not know.
Yeah.
Especially for me, I didn't think about there being a lot of Native Americans in that part of the U.S. I usually think about Texas and the deep Southwest.
Yeah.
So I'm learning that stuff too.
Yeah. And definitely also too in Longmire. I mean, and his best friend is
yes, that's
Henry
right.
Standing Bear too. Yeah.
I haven't read a Longmire book in a while, so I kind of forgotten that.
Yeah. No,
I've read all the Longmire books now, so I've gone on to somebody else.
Yeah. So we've got, Craig Johnson writes the Longmire books. We have CJ Box. He writes about Joe Pickett, the game warden. Nick Petrie writes about Peter Ash, who's kind of he's kind of a Jack Reacher type, a wandering veteran that's kind of doing good in these various situations. I also like to read Jack Reacher books. But then you also said William Kent Kruger has Cork O'Connor?
Cork O'Connor. And Cork is biracial. His mother was one of the indigenous people and his father was Irish.
Nice. Okay.
And so he's kind of torn between the two groups when he's doing his work.
Nice. So, go ahead.
Okay, I have to jump in here. Also, these gentlemen that we're talking about, and there are lots of more out there, but these gentlemen that we're talking about really are fantastic writers. They are wordsmiths. The way they describe things. And you're talking about us being educators. I'm going to use passages from these books to show my English people how you really describe something. Because when we teach people to write, we talk about you have to describe, you have to make people see things. And these books do this, I think, very well.
And and what's interesting is like they're action-oriented books. And so like, there's a fight happening, and it's like, I can actually understand the fight. Like I feel, oh gosh, you got hit in the face. Like, oh goodness, there's an elbow there. And like, or even just the different, chase scenes and things like that. You think about all the different, camera tricks and things that happen within movies and TV shows in order to make that sort of thing happen. And the only thing that they have are the words that they put on the page. And it is kind of amazing.
Yeah. Well, this last CJ Box book, he's describing one of the bad guys. And he's described as he looks like a gargoyle. Well, now, I mean, that's all you need to say. Most everybody has an image of a gargoyle. I'm having trouble saying that word. So he doesn't have to use a lot of words, but sometimes they use lots of words and it sounds wonderful, but sometimes just one word captures it. And that's what a good writer does.
Nice. So we mentioned our favorites. We kind of have these, so the general definition of like what these are, we're calling them like Western type novels. And even though some of them are, even I like the Jack Reacher ones, and even though those sometimes are in cities, it's still kind of Westernish if you're familiar with Westerns. Mm-hmm. And then again, there's some predictability to it. Like, all of a sudden they're in some situation and they got to figure it out. And which, happens in all these different, obviously, or else the drama doesn't go anywhere. And I was thinking back too about my Hardy Boys experiences where those were very formulaic. And I know you had some background on this with like, Frank and Joe Hardy are on a case, like get involved with a case and their dad's on a case and they're solving their case, their dad's solving a case. All of a sudden those cases intersect. And usually there's a friend involved too, that's like involved in a situation. And then oh my goodness, you find out that them solving that case is going to be helping their dad solve their case. And then like, oh, they foil everything. And it's, kind of a pretty formulaic that way, but it still was something that brought me back over and over again still. And maybe it kind of has echoes here with the kinds of stories that you see here that, usually know by the end of the book, there's going to be some resolution that's okay.
They're going to live happily ever after.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And
there's not
talking about the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and books like that. Those were formulaic books, and there was a stable of writers who wrote those books. Even though there was one person that was always on the cover, the writers would be given an outline, and then they would fill the outline in. Did you know that?
I did not know that. No.
Yeah.
So there was Franklin W. Dixon was not. I couldn't go find Franklin W. Dixon.
The only. He may have started it, but he was not the only person. Same thing with Nancy Drew and Sue Barton and all of those. It was the two of us could be doing that. We would get the outline and we would fill in the outline.
Nice.
So that's the formulaic part of it. Yeah, but there was a stable of writers.
And so that led me to, this is, this podcast is about learning how to teach better. And so, okay, we're reading these Western novels, and what are some extractions we could take to figuring out how to teach better? And one thing coming back is I can't remember how many of those Hardy Boys books I read, how many of these, Longmire and Peter Ash and like all these books that I've read. Why do I keep coming back if there is this pattern to them over and over again? And like, that is something like having like and it's something the way I like to teach too, is like, I have a structured expectation for how my classes go, where there's certain things that happen at the beginning, and then we do some in the middle, and then like at the end, and like there's the structure there. But then within those spaces is where, creativity happens. Like, oh, like we know we're doing this, but it's going to be different every time. And those that having that sort of, I guess, what we call them bones to a lesson, and having that there, even though that there's some comfort in expectation, but then there's also going to be some excitement in how each of those things come to be.
Yeah.
That was something.
And listening to writers, they say over and over again, every writer I've heard speak talks about the fact that they have an outline in their mind, but the story takes a life of its own. Mm. And so as we teach, and I think you just said this, as we teach, we have an outline in our mind, but as we teach, something happens that gets us off on a tangent that really is part of the lesson, but we hadn't thought about that. But it was kind of organic in that it moves itself. So I like that idea that, yes, they have an idea of where they're going, but sometimes the story writes itself.
Yeah, because they kind of have these characters that they've created, and how would their character, these, main characters of the text interact with those? Like, hey, there might be some differences going on, just like with whatever you're doing within your classroom, you're interacting with students, and like, how are they reacting to the thing that you have planned? Like, you might not know how it's going to go. And so, you go off in a different way.
You always have to, I tell my students a couple of things that you have to do if you're a teacher. You have to be flexible, and you have to be able to think on your feet.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And kind of getting to those, like, basically like landmarks that you have in your life. Like we might wander a little bit, but I eventually got to get there. So other lessons, learnings, I'm going to throw another one at you. These people, a lot of times they're living by a code. Like they kind of have, like we talked about, like our students having these, our pre-service teachers having like these philosophy statements, like that can guide them for what they would do if they interact with some situation. Like, oh, if I really believe in, fostering good relationships in my classroom, that means that I'm going to do X in this situation. And like these folks, you can imagine, like if Walt Longmire comes across a piece of litter on the road or on the sidewalk, he's going to pick it up. That's his code. Like he's going to do that. That's one like small thing that he's going to do. If he's going to go to a bar and order a beer, Walt Longmire always orders Rainier beer, like the same beer all the time. Or even too, if there's a choice between doing what's right and doing what's easy, he's going to do what's right, those sort of things. So like that living by that code, I think that's kind of attractive too, that there's there's some sort of like, I don't know, moral fabric, I guess, to them and their decision making.
Definitely agree with that. And I'm going to say but here, and I don't really mean but. They also need to realize that sometimes their code is not the code of the school they go into. Their code, I will use one of our students, and I don't think Evelyn would mind me using her on the podcast, Evelyn Smith, who defended her honors thesis this spring, and I had the pleasure of reading it. Talked about when she went into the classroom, she thought all students were going to be like she was. Very in tune to studying, very competitive, wanted to be the best, wanted to learn. And so her code was one, she didn't call it a code, but she had one idea of what the classroom was going to be like. But when she got in there, she realized that everybody didn't have that same idea. And so again, the idea of being flexible, recognizing that there are differences and being flexible with those differences.
Yeah. Well, and then seeing how these characters interact with people that don't have the same code,
moral code.
Yeah.
Right.
That's where some drama comes in there, yes. But then also thinking about, all right, well, what happens in those situations? And I was trying to think, and I was searching my head, like even the friends that each of these people have. So like we talked about Longmire, we have Vic Moretti, who's the deputy sheriff with Longmire, and then Henry Standing Bear's friend who owns a bar in town. And then we have Joe Pickett. I can't remember Joe Pickett's friend, who's the
Nate.
Falconer. What's that?
Nate.
Oh yeah. Nate Romanowski. Yeah. Falconer.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Falconer. Right.
That's right. And so they have different codes and they both recognize that, hey, you do things a little bit different than I do, but for some reason they both interact together. Like they want to do what's right, but they maybe have different ways of doing that or thinking what's right.
I think that is a very valid point that we, not just in teaching, but the world in general, we can be friends with people. We can have connections with people. We can work with people, and we don't all have to be exactly alike. We don't have to think alike. We don't have to act alike. We're allowed to have differing opinions. And with Joe Pickett and Nate, they definitely have different opinions because Nate wants to be off grid and just kind of anti-government.
Yep.
And Joe is the
government.
He's the government, and I'm going to do it by the letter of the law, no matter what. And so I like the idea that it shows just people in general that, hey, it's okay to be different. It's okay to have different ideas, and you can still be friends with people and you can still work together.
Yeah. I think there was one of the Pickett novels where he was going to the Grand Tetons and he was like going to be the ranger up there, which was kind of interacted with big business. Cause if you know the Jackson Hole area, there's lots of that happening. And he was interacting with a, who you thought would be like well, I don't want to spoil it. You thought it'd be someone that'd be the antagonist in the book. And actually when they talked to him, he actually was like, he had more in common with him than anyone else, but then it still ended up being in conflict. And it was like one of those things where it was surprising to see how like the characters interact, but then also too, like you said, having that open mind about who people are. And even though they're different than you get to see like, hey, we coming to the same conclusion of like, we have some things in common here and we can still work together. It doesn't, even though we're not the same or we don't have the same outlook on everything. So.
And see, I think that translates beautifully into the classroom because we have a lot of students who are raised very middle class and end up teaching in a lower class school. And they have to respect the code of the people, but we also want to teach them. So you can't be the sage on the stage.
Right.
You know that adage, sage on the stage and guide on the side. We really need to be the guides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Helping people, guides help people rather than telling them what to do.
Right. Yeah. And that means that getting to know people's stories and getting to interact with them, building those relationships, all that good stuff that we get to see. And I guess that too, it's another thing that we, even though that they're, you know, these people live by a code and everything, they still have their quirks. They're still flawed, right? They still have things that, you know, they're different differences and there's that you know that you're not reading about perfect human beings, right? And so like CJ Box is, over the course of the books, has had some marital troubles, and like there's some like disagreements happening, but then also you see how they resolve some of those things, and or else you've seen how Peter Ash is trying to deal with his PTSD and how he's working on himself and trying to do certain things, and whether successful or not. I think that's kind of neat too, is getting to see how, people dealing with their own personal problems and how that evolves over the course of reading several of these books, and like, oh, this is where Joe's at in how he's dealing with trying to afford things, right? They're always on a budget. They're always trying to, looking around and seeing people have everything and they're just barely scraping by, or else how Peter Ash is trying to, again, deal with PTSD and other things. I think that's kind of a nice thing.
Longmire really was kind of a loner, but Joe Pickett and Cork O'Connor both have not only wives, but they have children. And you see the children grow up and them dealing with teenage daughters, teenagers, and so on and so forth. And I think that's really interesting. That's a dynamic that I've never had because I don't have children. So it's interesting to me to read about the dynamics.
Yeah. So I don't know if you and I have got one other learning, and maybe you've got one too, but my one other learning is that what you notice in these things is things are better together. You're better together. Like you're better in relationships. You're better with friends. Like Joe Pickett is not as effective. He doesn't have his wife and his friend Nate, or even his dog and his horse. Like he needs things around. He needs people around him in order to make him better. And I think as a teacher, like thinking that you have all the answers, I think that was the biggest threat to my own teaching, was thinking that I had all the answers and like shutting my door and trying to like, well, I'm going to solve this myself, versus like reaching out to others and knowing like, hey, this person has a gift for this. This person has a gift for this. And if we use them to help my current problems in my teaching, I'm going to be a better teacher. So that's one thing I got out of this, is like that reinforcement that we're better together as in doing things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. You had mentioned when we talked about this, how we would use them in the classroom, and all of the social and emotional things we've talked about. But I go back to my English, and I've already talked about it. I want them to be readers and I want them to be writers. And these books are going to help people be both.
Nice. Yeah. Because also like people can probably think like, well, what would a situation in my current world? And so like, and we actually have a local writer, Ace Atkins, who writes things about people that live in around here, about a character that's in this basically community. And that might be interesting for some student to be like, oh, wow, that's a character from my neck of the woods, which is kind of neat, right? Yeah. And having those sorts of things. Well, being better together, this is one thing. I think we're coming up on 11 years together, Rosemary, since you. Oh
my goodness. Yeah.
Can you believe that?
Jack, how old is Jack? Because Jack didn't exist when you first came here.
Jack is 10.
Yeah.
So,
11 years. And Annie was in what? Preschool.
Yeah, she was going into 3K, and Noah was going to be in first grade. So, now he's going to be a senior in high school. So it's amazing.
So when we hire, and I was on your hiring committee, when we hire, I didn't know I was getting a fellow reader and so a fellow bibliophile. And so I'm very excited because we can share books, and I have shared books with you, and I've shared books with your kids. And I'll just swing back to your kids. They've helped me out with my teaching in that they tell me books that they like and don't like, and I can share that with my students and say, this is why they didn't like this book for whatever reason. So Noah, literally, for the people who are listening, would come into my office one afternoon after school and get a 200 or 300 page book and bring it back the next day. And he had read it and not just word called, he had read it. So when he told me he didn't like a book, I really took that to heart to tell my students, look, you're going to have kids that are really good readers and they're not going to like something. Right. So be careful when you're dealing with kids who don't like to read. Make sure that you're getting the books that they really want to read, because you can turn them off very quickly. my major professor in my doctoral program, Richard F. Abrahamson, used to say teachers had, when you're recommending books to students, it was like baseball. You had 3 tries. First strike, second strike. If you got that third strike, they're never going to come back to you and ask for a book again.
Yeah.
And so that's, again, going back to a comment I made at the very beginning, knowing lots and lots and lots of different types of books, genres. I am not a fantasy reader at all, but I read enough to keep myself abreast of it so I can recommend.
Nice. Well, and you say, and I know, and I just, given your experience with reading and everything, like you're saying, like also, whatever they read, let them read.
Let them read it.
So like I've been getting into the comic books a little bit. I used to love comics as a kid. And, there's all these, movies that come out, obviously, with the comic book characters. And it's not like they're making things up. These have already existed in the comics. So I want to go back and look at some of the comics that they have. And so like there's a movie called Thor, Love and Thunder. It's coming out. Well, that was a comic book series called Thor, God of Thunder. And I went back and read those comics. So I'm like, I already know what's going to happen in the movie. But it's kind of nice that those kids that are excited about those movies, like, hey, go read the comic. You want to learn more about it? You want to know why he's doing something? You want to know why that image that's on the trailer is so iconic? Well, go look at the comic, and there it is. So like there's ways, again, like you saying, like finding things that kids get excited about and making sure that they can attach it to something with reading. Like there's lots of possibilities out there.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with another point. You're talking about comic books. A lot of people think a kid shouldn't be reading comic books, or you've read enough comic books. In the reading field, it's something we call saturation. Mm-hmm. Once you have read enough of something that you are saturated with it, you will move on to something else. Mm-hmm. But you have to reach your own saturation point. Nobody else can reach that for you. And what a lot of parents and teachers do when a child will say, well, I want another Hardy Boys book, they will say, but you've read enough of those. You need to read something else. Well, when you saturate, and think about yourself, when you saturated with the Hardy Boys, you moved on to something else. And we don't let the kids saturate. I go back again a long time when Babysitter's Club was really big, and there were 100 something of those books. And parents would try to get the kids to move away from girls, especially Babysitter's Club, before they had saturated, before they were ready to move to something else. And when you move up. Mm-hmm. So once you've saturated, you move up.
Well, and the authors do that too. Cause like, I remember like I said, with the Hardy Boys, then there was the Hardy Boys, like Super Files with Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. But then there was the Hardy Boys Case Files, which were a little bit more sophisticated, and like people actually died in those books, but like they knew it. And so they would, hey, you would still like these characters. We're going to give you something else. But even thinking about our own experience with the Longmire books, well, then you move to Joe Pickett, and then like, oh, I want to dive into those because I'm done with Longmire. I'm good. Like, give me some Joe Pickett, give me some Peter Ash, give me some. I'm looking forward to Cork O'Connor. Mm-hmm. Loving it. So I love that idea of saturation. Look at this. Look at it. A little education through a pod. This is why podcasts are cool, Rosemary. This is now someone is going to be going for a walk, and they're going to learn something about reading today.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you, and I appreciate
Thank you for asking me. I've enjoyed this.
Yeah, this was fun, and I'm looking forward to our future conversations about some of these books.
Okay, and I'll drop the latest Longmire. I'm going to be in the office this afternoon, so I'll drop it this afternoon.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, that's it for this summer reading edition of the Amazon Planet podcast. If you're looking for any of the links to anything we mentioned here in the podcast, you can head to amazonplanet.com/episode 75. If you're looking for ways to support the podcast, you can subscribe, rate, and review. And you can also share this thing. If you heard anything like on this episode, maybe you have somebody else that kind of like your Rosemary to me is where somebody else that like shares their love of these sorts of summer reading and want to think about how you can take some of those lessons and learn how to teach better, or just even Rosemary's approach to thinking about reading. I kind of like and want to share it with others. I think it's a good approach, and she thinks deeply about reading and loves reading. And actually, I didn't know some of that information about her story with her reading. It was kind of unique. So anyway, if you want to share that, also take a look back at some of the previous episodes, especially recently. You know, we had Rob Harvilla from 60 Songs That Explain the 90s on this podcast. Isn't that kind of amazing? I can't believe he agreed to join us. And that was just a fun conversation. And then I've been continuing to listen to his podcast as he's doing 90 songs. So he's doing this, another set of 30 to get up to 90 songs that explain the 90s, but he's not changing the title of the podcast. But hey, look back at that episode and take a listen. Also, we had David Williamson Schaefer on the previous episode where we talked about how to create great images that help people along with a presentation, and also those same sort of lessons could be placed on images for brands and whatnot. So he thinks pretty deeply about this thing, about how to be memorable and how to really connect an audience with an image and make that memorable thing. And I know it's worked on me because he's got images that have stuck in my head, and hopefully I've take some of those lessons and create images that stick in other people's heads. But anyway, take a listen. There's other great stuff there too. Looking to create some good stuff coming up as well. So you can subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. That helps other people find this content. You can subscribe to the Amidon Planet download. That's the email list. You can go anywhere on amidonplanet.com. Go ahead and hit subscribe to the email list. So anytime we have some things we want to share, we'll put it out on the email list. Hasn't been too much lately, but we're looking to get that going in the very near future. You can also follow at Amidon Planet on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or like the Amidon Planet Facebook page. You can also check out the Amidon Planet store or Amidon Planet bookshop. Links are in the footer at amidonplanet.com, where your purchases support the production costs of the podcast. Finally, thank you for listening to this episode of the Amidon Planet podcast. Thanks to Rosemary Oliphant-Ingham for sharing her expertise and her time for this episode. Thanks to Matt Mifflin for the music of this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there who are seeking to teach better and be the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. This world is a better place because you have decided to use the gifts you've been given to serve others. Thank you for all that you do. Peace.